You're listening to Honestly Mental, the podcast, and I'm your host, Erika Diaz. I'm a wife, a mama, a woman in leadership, but y'all, I'm a perfectly imperfect human. I have depression, PTSD, and generalized anxiety disorder, and I am figuring it out every single day. It's really been quite the journey, so this podcast aims to provide a raw and authentic approach to several issues surrounding mental health. Through the lens of our guests and I, we will provide insight into how we navigated our own challenges through honest and vulnerable conversation. We are building a community of individuals committed to changing the world, one conversation, one person at a time. We are raising awareness by destigmatizing mental health through continuing the conversation. We are providing hope and ultimately have a goal of saving the lives of those who may be feeling dark and alone. Welcome to episode 14 of the podcast. This one is going to be a little different than the others. I previously shared a bit about my situation with learning about my biological father. So I figured I would talk through my experience with that and how it made me feel mentally, my experience in a partial hospitalization program for the second time, what additional tips and tricks I learned this go around, and how I'm doing today. So let's go ahead and get started. I know in the episode that I shared about my biological father and learning that the dad that I grew up with is not, in fact, my biological father, I didn't get into a whole lot of detail. So how did I kind of figure this out is a question that several people have been asking. And the story behind it is wild, but I know that I'm not alone. I have found a community of individuals who have learned similar circumstances, and there's terminology around it too. And we can be classified as NPEs or non-parent expected based on the DNA results from a test that I did. So to start off, I took a DNA test with sequencing.com, which focuses more on medical information with your DNA rather than family trees and genealogy and things like that. As I mentioned previously, the genealogy was a part of that, but the reason for doing it was not to locate family members or learn about my genealogy. It was actually to understand whether or not I'm at risk for Alzheimer's. So I have learned that my mother may have early onset Alzheimer's. Even though we don't have a relationship, I have figured that out and understand that she is going through a neurological workup to either eliminate that or confirm that that may be what is going on with her. So because of that, I wanted to see if I was at risk myself. And so I went to the internet and found sequencing.com and took a test. When I got those results back, I did learn I am in fact potentially at risk for Alzheimer's, along with some other medical findings that I am working through with my doctor. So that was really where it started. And I looked at my genealogy. I got my results back in, I can't even remember, April or May. And saw my genealogy. I was surprised to find that I'm not as much of a mutt, if you will, as I had thought. My genealogy is only broken out into a few different ethnicities. And so I learned that I was 26% Japanese. And at first, this wasn't, I don't know, I didn't really think about it. It hadn't hit me. I just was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And then my cousin was over spending time with us, And I shared with her a little bit about the test and what I had done. And she goes, Erika, how does that work? You're 26% Asian, but your dad is not. So the mathing isn't mathing. And then it hit me. It hit me hard. I may still be a little emotionally blunted as it relates to this whole thing. But I'm working through it. And so, yeah, she pointed that out. I realized that there was no chance that my father was my biological father after finding out my genealogy. At first, though, I asked my aunt on my maternal side if we had any Asian ancestry, and she explained that we have relatives that settled from England, but not Asian or Japan. So Japanese, rather. And that was that. She asked why, and I explained why I was asking, and there's really not a whole lot to be said about it, right? Initially, that was kind of the response that I got from people is speechlessness or not really knowing how to react. And I can understand that because I didn't know how to react to it either. So from there, we figured out that there probably needed to be a conversation with my mother. And so my cousin offered to be somewhat of a go-between because I don't have a relationship with her, and give her a phone call. And the initial call, when my cousin explained that I was 26% Japanese, my mother's reaction was to break down crying and explain that she couldn't do this right now and that I should talk to my dad. There was a lot of concern about what my dad had shared with me, and that he knew the truth and that I just needed to talk to him. So my cousin let me know that, and my mother didn't really confirm or deny the findings, but obviously she had a visceral reaction to the news. So something was going on. My cousin also asked her mom, my other aunt, about whether or not she knew anything, and the response was, again, not confirming or denying that my biological father wasn't the dad that I grew up with, but rather I should talk to my mother. So as you could see, I was going around and around with different family members, trying to learn about this information, trying to collect answers because my world had really been flipped upside down. My cousin talked to my mother a second time and learned that there was always a possibility that I was not my father's. And she explained, there was a gentleman that she had dated. His name was Keith. Didn't really have a whole lot of information other than the fact that they met at a bar in the local town that I grew up in Michigan, and that he worked at GM in the computer or IT department. So it didn't really give me a whole lot to go off of, but I spoke with my dad, who confirmed as well that he was aware there was always a possibility that he was not my father. But he explained that I was his before I was born, I was his once I was born, and that I am still his today, even with this news. And I can't really thank him enough for the kindness that he has shown me throughout all of this. as you can imagine, he's devastated too. It's been really hard news for him to handle. He has been my father for now 36 years, and I learned this information just a couple months ago, right? So it's all still very fresh. After I learned that information, I tried to Google things, look up things on Facebook, try and do searches like on LinkedIn, looking for people that their name was Keith and they worked at GM in Flint, Michigan. But I didn't find anything because I had too little information to go off of and without a last name. And while I was trying to leave no stone unturned, it wasn't really effective. So that was the middle of May. I learned all of this on my anniversary, which was interesting. I also reached out to my mom to speak with her myself, and I hadn't spoken to her in over a year. So it was interesting. I had planned what I was going to ask. I worked through this in therapy, and I just had a few questions that I wanted answered. And one was, do you have a last name? Do you know what school he went to and where he lived? And just anything else she could share with me. So she explained that she was on a pool league at the local bar in my hometown where I grew up. And it was late at night. She was living in a small little house not too far from the bar. And so she was just going to walk home. A gentleman asked her if she wanted a ride, and she said no, that she was fine. But then he explained that he had a Ferrari, which leads me to believe that my life could have been a lot different than it was, but that's okay. So she ended up taking the ride, and he took her home, and they didn't exchange phone numbers or anything like that. It was just a ride. I guess a few days later, he showed up in the driveway, and they started dating for a short period of time. And that was really about it. She explained they didn't have cell phones back then, which of course they didn't. And so it was a lot different keeping in touch with people, and that they just stopped communicating, I guess. And so that was it. That was all that I was able to gain from the conversation with my mom. During this time that I had the conversation with my mom, I was in my Partial Hospitalization Program, or a PHP. I feel like you guys probably know that term by now, but for new listeners, I just want to call it out. But I entered a Partial Hospitalization Program for a second time. The first time I had done it was early last year in February, March, when I participated in that the very first time when I had my mental health crisis due to wrapping my identity entirely into work. And so, man, you know, the month of April and May, those months were so good. I finally felt like myself again, even though, you know, I had that mental health crisis. But I also realized that I hadn't felt myself in probably 5, 6, maybe even 7 years. That's how good of a place I was in. And then in May 21st, when I confirmed that my dad was not my dad, that all really started to change. I stopped showering again. I was actually dealing with thoughts of wanting to self-harm, which was something that I hadn't really dealt with since I was in high school. And my anxiety was off the charts. It was not in the form of panic attacks, which was really new for me, but between the anxiety and the self-harm thoughts, I began picking at my skin, at my face, and really kind of destroying it. I have a lot of scarring and stuff now. It's healing. I have had medication adjustments, and so I think that's helped quite a bit. I wasn't struggling with suicidal ideation as much this go around. It was there, but it wasn't as severe or as active as it had been last year. So I would say it was more passive or fleeting thoughts of wanting to unalive myself or just wanting to not wake up, things like that. So a lot different than it was previously. I think because everything had manifested itself so differently, it took a lot longer for me to recognize the signs and symptoms that I was experiencing another mental health crisis. You would think that maybe after one, someone would be able to catch on to that a little quicker, but it was so different. And I highlight that because, everybody's journey is so individualized to them, whether it's the way they work through therapy or medicinal approaches, things like that. Everything is so different from person to person. What works for one person may not work for another. The way symptoms show up may look entirely different from person A to person B, even if they have the same set of diagnoses. So for me, it was weird that I was still one person and my symptoms were so entirely different than they were the last time I experienced my breakdown. So I highlight that again to stress how even the same person can have stressors and factors show up much differently than what they're used to. The other thing that was going on with me is my anxiety and the tension that was going on within my body was all being stored within my jaw. So I began clenching, and not so much grinding, but really clenching my jaw to where I was in so much pain that it hurt to sleep on the left side of my face. It hurt to eat. It hurt to yawn. It was just so different, and that's why I entered a PHP program again, because it was so different. I didn't feel like I had the tools, even though I had the tools. I had forgotten some of the tools that I had learned previously. And that's what happens during crises, is sometimes these things, especially if you're not practicing them regularly, they go out the window and you can't recall them in the moments that you need to. So one of the biggest lessons that I have taken away from this experience is how, even though I don't need all of the different techniques like emotional regulation, interpersonal effectiveness, mindfulness, and distress tolerance, I have to figure out ways to work those coping mechanisms and the tips and tricks that I learned into my daily routine so that I can recall in the event that I find myself in another crisis situation. And that's okay. So it's during the PHP programs, they explain how you can come back anytime you need to. And so I knew it was an option, and I needed to break my thought cycles that were occurring. So I went back in. This time it was a lot different of an experience. I chose a different facility just because I wanted to see what other types of programs were out there and how they may vary from one to the next. And it was different. I still got a lot of benefit from it. The biggest difference was the first program had what I would call processing time in group. So we had in the morning a check-in where we would go through how we were feeling for the day. Were we having suicidal thoughts or ideation? Did we use any illicit drugs or overuse prescription medication? All those types of check-in questions when you are going through a mental health crisis. And then toward the end of that, we would have the opportunity to share as a group what may be surfacing for us. And we would have that group time again in the middle of the day after learning some of the other curriculum and tips and tricks and tools to put in our toolkit. We would reconvene and have the opportunity to process again. So you didn't always have to speak, and not everybody did, but what it did do was create a sense of community, because you learned a little bit about why people were there, and it made it seem less lonely than the second program that I did. It just took a lot longer to learn about one another and have that sense of community. But one really amazing thing about the second program that I did is each of the courses were taught by therapists. And we would have one course at the end of the day that would be taught by like the nurse or another clinician, occupational therapists. But we would have 3 groups a day that were led by therapists. And also at any time, if you needed to speak with a therapist, you could ask to speak to a therapist, and you would be able to work through what it is that you're going. So the difference was processing as a group versus processing individually. And quite frankly, I think both programs were amazing. I don't know that I liked one over the other. I do know that I just missed a little bit of that group processing time, but that wasn't make it or break it for me. I would absolutely go back to the second program because of the experience that I had. So that was the PHP. I was in the program for 9 days over the course of 3 weeks. I went in on a Thursday and I completed my program on a Tuesday. I did that while I was on vacation as well. Our family took a camping trip, and it was, I guess, like a staycation because it was quite close. And so I would still go to the PHP during the day and head back to the campground at night, and did that for 3 days. And then that was that. So I was left to my own and resurfaced my toolkit and all the things that I had learned previously, and also had medication adjustments. I think the medication adjustments were huge in relaxing the anxiety that I was experiencing. I now am in a place where I'm not clenching my jaw as frequently. I can tell when my medication is starting to wear off because it starts coming back. And I have to take that medication 3 times a day to keep it in my system to avoid those anxious feelings, or the overwhelming anxious feelings, if you will, because I still have anxiety. As you all know, I have my lovely depression, generalized anxiety disorder, and PTSD, all things that play here every day, really, whether I'm having a good day or a bad day. Anyway, so what's next with my bio-dad situation? Let's see, last weekend I was on TikTok, of all places, just scrolling through like you do in the middle of the night when you can't sleep. And I happened upon a video that talked about a company called DN Angels. And I hadn't even searched anything like services to find biological parents or anything like that, but you know how technology is weird and gets in your head, and it's a little creepy and can pick up on things that are going on in your life. Well, a TikTok video appeared that was about a similar story of somebody who had taken a DNA test, learned that their biological parent was not theirs, and they were an NPE. Again, that's non-parent expected. And they talked about this service, and how they helped them find their biological parents. So I Googled it and found them on Facebook, and I learned that they're a nonprofit organization and they help all sorts of people. They've helped over 6,000 people find their biological relatives from DNA test kits the direct-to-consumer test kits that people are doing these days. So I reached out on Tuesday last week, which was would have been the 23rd of July, and they took my case. I gave them some information through Messenger. They had access to my ancestry DNA, which reminds me that I didn't explain that I took a second DNA test to find more familial matches. So I went with ancestry DNA. I did get those results back and had a very close relative that I shared more DNA with than my maternal grandfather, who had done a test, so I was matched with him. I reached out through the messaging that you can do within Ancestry's app, and I didn't hear back. I did then learn on July 7th they logged in, so I'm assuming they saw the message, but I decided to send a second one just saying, hey, following up on the above. At that time, I didn't realize how close of a relative they were. I thought that maybe it was an aunt or a cousin. As time had passed, though, I realized that it was probably a half-sibling. And so I decided that I was going to do a third DNA test through 23andMe, hoping that I would get even more matches because I felt like I hit a dead end. So back to DNA Angels. It's like DNA Angels with just one A is basically what it is. So nonprofit organization aimed at helping individuals find their biological parents when they've done DNA tests. So they took my case, and Wednesday, the 24th, I was on a girls' trip with some women, and I got a message that they had solved my case in a day. They found my biological father, and I had a first and last name. I had potential address history, phone numbers, email addresses for both my biological father and what is now my half-sister. So that's who the individual was with the ancestry DNA. It was confirmed that she was my half-sister based on all the research that they had done to find them. It's a pretty neat process. It worked really quickly in my case. I have not reached out to either of them since I have learned this information. I have discovered who they are on some social media sites, but haven't done anything with it. I plan to work through that in therapy and figure out a plan of attack, because at the end of the day, the reality is this turned my world upside down to the point where I had to go through PHP again. I can only imagine that it could potentially do the same in the means of turning their world on its head. And so I've got to be patient, and I'm trying to be very logical about how I approach this because I do want a relationship with them, but I also know that that may not happen, and I could be rejected entirely, or there could be an initial reaction because they are human and this is life-changing information. Based on what I found on social, it seems like my biological father really loves his family and his kids. And so I, kind of have like a sliver of hope there that maybe he'll embrace me, but I can't get my hopes up because I don't want to regress again from a mental health perspective from where I was at. So I'm in a good place today. I still have good days. I have bad days. I know I already said that. Some of this feels like a little bit like rambling, but I appreciate you staying here and listening to this crazy story of my life. So that's really it. That's where things stand as of now. And I hope to share another update with you guys when there is one. And as I said, I appreciate you hanging with me and going along the journey with me. It makes me feel as though I'm not alone. As I mentioned earlier, I learned that this happens way more frequently than probably it had been in the past, just because of the access to DNA testing. So it's really just a wild ride. I did want to share some of the tips that I was reminded of during this program, because I think you could utilize them yourself for anybody listening. And it is practicing mindful self-compassion and loving kindness. So there's a quote by Linda Graham that says, mindful self-compassion teaches us to notice and focus on our feelings, but then gives us a practice to shift those feelings. So anytime you feel like a surge of a difficult emotion, maybe it's shame or even just boredom, you could do things like pausing and placing your hand on your heart. As simple as that is, it activates the release of oxytocin, and that is the hormone of safety and trust. You can empathize with your experience and recognize the suffering to say, this is upsetting. It is powerful to be able to name what is happening. And it's okay to say that this hurts. It's just, a way to acknowledge and care about yourself as the experiencer of something distressing. You can also repeat phrases to yourself. I know I've talked about affirmations in the past, but things like, may I be kind to myself in this moment. So that breaks the automatic nature of our survival responses and negative thought loops, right? So it's the opposite of that. A lot of what is taught in PHP is dialectical thinking, or DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, which was spearheaded or developed by Marsha, Linehan. And dialectical thinking is having two thoughts it's a paradox. So two opposing thoughts that can be true at the same time. So you can think something like, I am capable, but I also need help right now. And actually, I shouldn't use the word but. It is and. Yes, I am capable and I need help right now. And that is completely okay. Again, there's power in naming what you need or how you're feeling. And that is the way dialectical thinking works. And a lot of the teachings at the PHP are based on Marsha Linehan's DBT practices. Another thing that is a part of mindfulness is radical acceptance. So just accepting the moment exactly as it is and being willing to have it so. So acceptance is often the first step to overcoming the consequence of any misfortune. So radical acceptance is saying it is what it is, accepting it as such. It doesn't have to be good or bad. It doesn't justify what somebody did. It doesn't mean that it's your fault. It doesn't take away accountability for other people's actions, but it enables you to radically accept that the moment is exactly as it is. And you can accept yourself in that moment. So once you accept that, then you have the power to change, right? And these are things that you have to practice on a regular basis to keep them in your toolkit and keep them primed and flex those muscles, right? The other thing is loving kindness, and that's to increase love and compassion towards yourself. So what is loving kindness? It's the mindful practice designed to increase love and compassion first for ourselves and then for our loved ones, friends, or for those who are angry with, for difficult people, enemies, and then for all beings. Loving kindness can protect us from developing and holding on to judgmentalness, ill will, and hostile feelings towards ourselves and towards others. So practicing loving kindness is similar to saying a prayer for yourself or someone else if you are the praying kind, or just having positive thoughts for yourself or someone else. It's the adage of, how would you talk to a friend? Well, you wouldn't tell a friend that they're a piece of crap and they are worthless and helpless and all of those things. You wouldn't talk to a friend that way. So practicing loving kindness is also, a way to show compassion to yourself. And it's very helpful in breaking the negative thought cycles. The other thing that I was reminded of is just understanding your emotions and the power behind naming them. When you are able to regulate your emotions, and it starts with understanding them and naming them, then you can work toward decreasing the frequency of those unwanted emotions. One of the ways to do that I have to keep in mind constantly is checking the facts. And the way you do that is by asking, what is the emotion that I want to change? What event is prompting that? So describe the facts that you observed through your senses. Challenge judgments, any absolutes or black and white thinking. I know our brains love binary thinking, but the messy middle is where, it requires a lot of work, right? Ask, what are my interpretations, thoughts, or assumptions? So think of other possible interpretations, like practice by looking at all sides of the situation and all viewpoints, and test your interpretations and assumptions to see if they fit the facts. Am I assuming a threat? Label that threat. Assess the probability of it. Is it a catastrophe, right? There are ways to imagine that the catastrophe is really occurring, and then you can cope with it through problem solving or radical acceptance. And does my emotion, and finally, the last thing to ask is, does my emotion or its intensity fit the actual facts? Now, this is something that you can do to actually, you can practice it by writing these questions down and answering them on paper to get to the facts. And I would say you'll probably find that sometimes your emotions may be misaligned to an event that occurred. One of the other super helpful things that I was reminded of was opposite action. So this goes along with dialectical thinking and behavior, but opposite action is doing something that is the opposite to from what you're currently experiencing to change your emotions. So for me, because I like to self-isolate when I am in a crisis, the way that I get around this is by not self-isolating. I know it seems super simple, but it can be very difficult to actually get through that successfully. So it's really, truly a practice of naming how you're feeling, thinking of how you can do the opposite, and then following through on that. And I would say start small with this. That's what I've done when I want to go lay down in the bedroom and just binge out on TV. I instead, maybe I can't quite play with the kiddos, or I'm not ready for that type of interaction yet. I can instead watch TV on the couch so that if the family is around, we're in the same room and I'm not closed off and isolated. So baby steps there can help it be more consumable and manageable. And those are a lot of the tips that I learned throughout the program that I had forgotten to work through. that about wraps up what I wanted to cover in this episode. I know it's kind of an interruption from our regularly scheduled programming. I'm just kidding. But I know it's a little different. So again, I just can't thank you enough for hanging with me, continuing to subscribe and like the podcast and listen in. It means the absolute world. And of course, we change the world one story, one person at a time. And if you could share this podcast out to your network, the more people we have listening, the more the more lives we can save. Thank you. Take care.